The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the English Language Learner District Collaborative, a new initiative at MTSU College of Education to give support, to give professional development opportunities for the people in our districts who teach and support and facilitate services for English language learners. Today we have a group of people who represent 6 districts across Middle Tennessee, and they are sharing their expertise and thoughts on the issue of progress monitoring of language proficiency. And so with this, I will introduce Rose Murray from Fayetteville City Schools, our presenter today.
Okay, this morning we kind of went over a few different tools that I found. There was TELL, SELP 2, Woodcock Munoz, and IPT, which was a couple of people had already used IPT for their districts. And I think across the board, we kind of all agreed that TELL was probably the most efficient for us, time-wise, cost-wise, things of that nature. And we kind of started a discussion about why that was and why the others were not what we needed. So we can go ahead and keep having that discussion if there are any more questions, if we want to talk about it a little bit more.
Can you expand on the students that would best be progress monitored?
I would probably, as far as which ones you would progress monitor, especially in larger districts, because there's not the time or the manpower to be able to progress monitor everybody. I would kind of either focus in on those ones that are almost there, those ones that are about to get out, that you hope will test out. That way you can kind of see where they're falling, because those reports with the TELL especially, those reports kind of sync and they're similar, so you can see where they're lacking, looking at their WIDA scores to see where they're lacking and then comparing where those progress monitoring. And then also you've got those children that you suspect have disabilities. Those are another good group of kids that you would progress monitor, because if you don't have the data backing, you can't say that it's not a language issue, because I know that that's a wall that we all run into whenever you know that there's something else going on but you can't prove it. Whenever you've got a kindergartner that's never taken anything but the screener, but just walking that child down to the first moment you see him and you start talking to them and you're walking them down to your room to test them, you're like, no, there is something else going on, and you know it from get-go. That's a kid that I would progress monitor, so that you have that data, because you're going to have so many points of that kind of data before you can even look at it, especially without parent requesting. And a lot of those parents aren't going to know to request that type of testing. That's me. That's what I would do, but somebody else might have a different view on who you should or should not.
Would you recommend monitoring a level 1 or level 2?
Probably the lower levels. If you've got the time, just to know, especially since there's the additional diagnostic screeners, especially in the TELL, there's the additional diagnostics that you can give them to have those skills, because WIDA is not going to give it all to you. It's not. Whenever you look at those access scores, it doesn't go into the actual, it does, but it doesn't. It's not giving you, whereas some of those you're looking at, it goes into more subtests where you're actually, is it they can put the word in the right spot in the sentence, but are they just doing it because they're a good guesser? Do they actually understand?
Like I've got a first grade student, probably multiple, but just it's a good example. To me, he is very typical of an ESL student. I think he is textbook. So, in my opinion, he will, and again, I said in my opinion, I understand that it's an opinion, he's definitely going to need to stay in ESL next year. You know, he's just learning, he's making good progress in the classroom, but I know he's going to need more ESL support. So like, I'm not going to progress monitor that student.
Because you already know.
Right, and we're just moving through, you know.
He's making progress.
Yes, he's making progress. It's slow progress, but I mean, we're moving.
It's steady.
So I would not want to take my time away from helping him continue to progress.
To test him.
For 15 minutes. Whereas there may be another first grader, we've already had since kindergarten, flatlining somewhat, not really making much progress compared to his peers. So I'm going to progress monitor him.
It's really just a case-to-case basis.
And like I have a student that came from another state last year, this school year I have her, and she took WIDA in another state last year. And like she scored a 6, a 1, and a 3.7. So if I didn't test her 1 was in speaking. So if I didn't test her in anything but speaking, I would like to use TEL with her for speaking just to have the practice. Because the child is brilliant, but she just has zero confidence when it comes to speaking, obviously. So, and I think just seeing that on the screen, being able to talk back to it and train herself to do that, because I've already had her online reading books, you know, and taping herself and listening to herself talk. Because I think some of them just freak out once they hear themselves that very first time. It's like,
and she can see her progress. If we've got instant results, you know, or they're doing it, then she can track that too.
Right, and so that's somebody that I immediately thought of. And then I have one of my first graders that's flatlining, and I'm very concerned about him. And I think sometimes he doesn't, you can't tell if he really gets it or if he's just,
Getting good at compensating.
Yeah, getting good at compensating. And so I would like to progress monitor him because I can see growth in the other two already. I'm not seeing it, you know, in his peer group with him specifically. So I would like to progress monitor that one child just to see if he's really making progress or if he's flatlining.
And first grade seems to be I think first grade is like that turning point. It's a pivotal time.
When you say flatline, you're just saying, anecdotally, you're not seeing any progress out of him. Not necessarily, he's not making progress on a specific test.
He's not regressing, he's not progressing.
Like he's stuck on a reader. He's been stuck on the same reader, and we've read it and read it and read it. You know, practiced, I don't mean the whole hour. I'm talking a short segment of time, you know, each day. It's not a specific test, but just overall, just teacher observation.
Yeah.
My other kids' sight words were moving right on.
And classroom teacher conferencing.
Right. Classroom teacher conferencing, she's saying the same thing. He has to be redirected constantly and things like that. And I don't know if it's an attention thing or and he's not getting anything, or if it's just, I would just like to see if he's actually making progress or if he's not. I suspect he's not,
Right.
You know.
Would you progress monitor someone who already has an IEP and has been in ESL for multiple years and not likely to ever test out?
That would be one of those,
Any benefit?
that would probably be one of those special cases where you would use it to be able to justify that this child is not making any progress in ESL. Because sometimes the ESL is not the service that they need. Yes, there is language proficiency issues because there is stuff, they only speak another language at home, but that's not the underlying issue. They have developmental delays that are causing the language proficiency, them not to catch up like they should. And that would be, once they're, I don't know, that one's a hard one because a lot of times, I mean, I've had a child that we stopped ESL services to give only SPED services to. And once we stopped the ESL, and he went strictly SPED services, we saw progress, not only academically, his speech, because he started going to speech, he started getting PT, he started getting other services that were more beneficial than the ESL services. But you have to have the data to back not giving them the ESL services. So in that case, you could use it initially. Now, would you keep doing it? No. But to initially prove that these services are not doing what they need to, I would. That's my opinion. I'm not sure that anyone else has that same opinion, but having both, being on both sides of the fence with that, sometimes those ESL services aren't what's going to do it. They need that more intense SPED intervention that's going to give them what they need. And that progress monitoring would prove that.
Yes, and Janet said that typically those kids will never exit
They never
ESL
will.
from our list. But if the IEP team agrees together
That they don't.
that they're not benefiting from ESL, then we wouldn't need to serve them. They would still be on our roster. So it
And
seems
they'll
like
have
this
to
is a way
take,
to
and
do
they
that.
have to take the,
They would
and they have to take the weed out.
And they're still coded as L's.
They're still coded as L's.
They get the accommodation.
My issue is,
And
I've
the
never heard
accommodations.
that, I've never heard her say that.
She has said that, so.
That was,
Yeah.
wasn't that discussed at the last meeting here?
It's come up a few times.
I think it,
I think that was, but with that new manual we're all supposed to have, there's supposed to be a procedure for it, so that it's not a case-to-case basis, that it's something you do across the board. Because if you have this child that you did it for, but you have another child that you didn't, it just has to be the same across the board. You have to have a procedure that if this is what arises, this is how we handle it. And if you do decide to progress monitor that child, if we progress monitor and this, and this is what happens, then yes, they still get ESL services. But if this, and this happens, then no, they don't. And as a team, we decide that they don't, then they don't get it.
So maybe that might be something for another session is.
Looking at that
As
procedure.
districts, let's look at that procedure, because that seems to continue to come up more
Yes.
and more and more. And it would be great for us to say, oh yes, that's what Murray County does, that's what Bedford County does. We're
that's
all
where we
doing
talked
that.
about it, was at the July 5th meeting. That's where we were. We had a meeting on July 5th in Bedford County. That's where it was discussed.
I was there.
Yes.
And I'm
where you-
well,
Yeah.
there's only so much I want to say on camera, but I was there.
Yes, we had that discussion, and I remember having that discussion because I teach middle school also, and that's why it popped in my brain. Because my 7th grade group, that's why.
And if you and we have procedures, and they're the same across the board. I think a lot of time now, especially, we're getting to a point where they're getting to middle school, and that gap has become so large. Not just in their language proficiency, but academically, that gap has become so big that we don't know how to close it. I don't know how to close it, and there's only.
I didn't mean to interrupt. Special situations come up. I had a 7th grader who missed school for 3 years in Mexico. Was in our system, left for the 3 years, did not go to school for 3 years, came back and was in 7th grade. She's lost.
She is.
Really just lost.
And then in that situation, you can't go the SPED route because they haven't been in school for 3 years. Lack of exposure. You can't take that route. But I think with maybe looking at these tools and us looking at a procedure to have for that type of situation, maybe
It's been there since kindergarten,
The
since
child that's-
first grade.
yes, so that we have a procedure, because if we catch it in kindergarten, 1st grade, we're more likely to close that gap and possibly exit them from ESL and even SPED if it's just an SLD, or if it's not
Too severe.
If it's not too severe, we have a chance of closing that gap and not only exiting them from SPED services, but exiting them from ESL services. And that's if we can, that's what we want. And we don't want to identify them in 7th and 8th grade when they're frustrated. Their teachers are frustrated, they're frustrated, we're frustrated because nobody knows what to do. And you've got teachers coming at you saying, well, they're sitting in class and they're doing this and they're lost and they don't know what to do. There's more going on, but we haven't been able to identify it yet.
Which is why you want that team, you want that IEP team, you want multiple eyes on the student because, I mean, you don't want to prematurely be putting kindergartners
Yes,
and first graders because in the past that's what's happened and I think that's what has led us to this point.
So we've gone from one extreme to another extreme.
Yes, so it's finding that balance and I think that's where that procedure of the IEP team agrees collectively is huge.
I think a big part of maybe not identifying them as early is the fact that we try to, or at least I do, I try to get my students and pull them out during a time like RTI time. But if they're one of those students that needs that RTI, then they're not getting both. You see what I'm saying? So we they get lost because they're maybe not going to other interventions when they need it.
But that's another thing. If we have the progress monitoring tool that we are looking, we can keep track a little bit better. Do we need to pull them during RTI or do we need to find a different time? It's going to be a headache. But
well, that's where it would be very
headache.
helpful along the state routes to have, in place and make the requirement of teachers to do balanced literacy because ideally, the ideal plan would be that during RTI, they go to academic interventions.
yes.
And then during the end of after whole group instruction, whenever a teacher should be pulling small groups of students, that be the time that the ESL teacher serves them. But that requires, enforcement of the core curriculum schedules in classrooms, and that's a really hard, what I'm realizing is that moving out of Metro, that is very difficult to do.
I think we're all in agreement that early intervention is the ideal, and that's when we want to identify them. However, since we have people in the room who work with 4th graders, who work with 6th graders through 8th graders, are there any particular pointers that you would give in terms of progress monitoring or any of the other comments we're making in terms of serving the older children?
I have some ESL that aren't classified SPED, but I still pull them.
Yes.
Some, because like one of my particular students, for example, he is very, very bright, but he has a learning disability in reading. So I do a lot of history stuff with him to help him with his history because he can't read it all by himself and comprehend it. And the inclusion assistant, he doesn't want to be pulled to the side with the inclusion assistant and singled out. He'd rather be with me.
Yeah.
And so I do pull out for him. So I do see the need sometimes for SPED and ESL.
Yes, and there are cases where that is ideal.
Right.
But and most of the time, the ones that you're going to stop the ESL are the more profoundly disabled children, where you've got a whole lot more going on than just than the normal.
Right.
That's going to be the time that you stop the ESL services, and that there of course has to be a procedure, but it's also looking child by child, and that's why there has to be a team decision. Now, a middle school child, they're going to need as much help as they can get in those classes, especially if they do have an SLD, especially if it's in reading and they have SPED and ESL. That child's going to need both services. They're going to need it because they're going to need that test read aloud, but not only are they going to need that test read aloud to them, they're probably going to need a lot of explanation of vocabulary because they don't have any help to do that at home because their parents don't know it. So I think the older children, yes, there's going to be more cases where we're going to need both services. But I think the younger ones, I think if we figure out a way to monitor them and figure it out to stop the ESL of the team, makes that decision, so they can have those more intense interventions. And if we need to pick up ESL, then we can pick up ESL at another time. But more than likely, when you come back to pick up ESL with those earlier interventions, they're ready for what you're doing. They're more prepared for that, and they have the maturity there and a lot of those gaps. Because you're not just, especially when they're little, you're not just you're looking at motor skills. And can they even hold a pencil, especially if you're looking at developmental delays and things like that. You're looking at, can they even hold the pencil, or their gross motor skills, their fine motor skills. You're looking at the whole child at that point. And a lot of them just aren't ready for what you're doing in ESL, and how you've got to get those developmental issues, those gaps kind of closed before you can do this. And so I think the earlier grades are going to be where you kind of halt ESL, pick up SPED, and then probably bring back ESL at some point when the time
We did that last year.
is ready.
Right. I did that last year with one of mine. He had been my student in the elementary school when I was there full time, and he had been identified in 3rd grade, went into SPED and stayed in SPED, and then exited SPED, and then I picked him back up in ESL last year, and he exited ESL. I saw the whole revolution.
That's the story. There's your whole revolution,
Yeah.
right?
And that's what we want. We don't want a child that's just been looked at and said, nope, there's nothing wrong with them. They just don't know English. That's the problem. That's the problem. And you keep trying to fight for this child, saying, no, this is not the issue. This is not it. And then we're in middle school and somebody finally says, oh, there is something else wrong. Well, if we had caught this in 1st grade when I first said something, we would be in a whole different boat right now.
Sometimes you have to oversimplify that when talking to people. We've asked the question before, if this child acquires 100 more English vocabulary words, is that going to help that child tremendously in your classroom? And so many times they're like, no, that's not what's really going to help them. And I'm like, well, okay, then you ask some more questions that are really just what ESL classes are doing. Mm-hmm. And so many times when they're answering no to that, then ESL is not what they need. But I do think that we owe a big thank you to the lowering of the student-teacher ratio because of all of these circumstances and having so many needs, even in a group of as small as 4 students, being pulled at a time. So I think the state and anybody else needs to hear that is very much appreciated.
I have a question. What's the protocol then for, let's say, I have 2 students that I serve together, a kindergartner and a 1st grader. And the kindergartner came to pre-K, and I serviced him a little in pre-K when I had the opportunity in my schedule, and then it became where I couldn't. But he is on a way different level. Like you said, I can tell there's something. I've gone over 2 letters, and he still can't get them, after a week or 2 weeks. So I know there's something going on because he went through all that in pre-K and should at least know a letter,
Yes.
But my 1st grader is a higher level, and I really need to be one-on-one with them, but my time limits, my scheduling issues, because I'm like you, the district I'm in is like yours, and there's just not another time to really service them. So what would the protocol be to say this kindergartner really needs to go to RTI and see if this is helping him? Or, you can't show any data because there's no data to...
See, I think in that, there's nothing you can really do.
So you can't really hit them up at kindergarten, 1st grade level.
Well, kindergarten.
Maybe later.
Well, if you have the progress monitoring and there's
20 data points or
however many data points,
12.
I think it's 12. I think it's 12 data points. You could potentially get that with a progress monitoring tool.
That's where, to me, if you have a really good relationship with somebody, because I think it goes back to our time and even what ESL is considered like, technically they don't really want us, we're not an intervention. We're not interventionists. They really don't want us running these programs that RTI is running. However, if you can service that kid during your ESL pool and then talk really sweetly to someone just to progress monitor off of an intervention tool, I think that would be the most ideal.
To 3 years ago when RTI first came, or around the time RTI was first starting, I did that with some of my ESL. Their intervention time was with me, and we overlapped the time to where they could get both in, and I kept up with but yeah, that's
it's hard when they're little. It is hard to prove. I know, I mean, with the language proficiency though, you can prove, if you're doing that on that type of child, monitoring their language proficiency, then you can at least prove that the language isn't the issue.
Well, I know language is somewhat of an issue with this child too, because he doesn't hear English much, only at school, and he's just in kindergarten. So I know language is an issue, but it's also an issue that I'm having to spend time doing letters where this kid over here needs to be reading books, and you know, it's a hard balance to try to figure out.
See, in that, I mean, I guess in that, like, I'm just thinking about, like, as you're saying that, there's, like, the little one that's reading, I mean, you can have him read, and auditorially, I mean, he might catch up on he might pick up on the comprehension stuff, and then kind of stop and ask him to find a certain letter, or which letter makes this sound, like, within the book, or just try to fit it. I mean, I know it's not ideal.
As much differentiation
as you can get.
That's kind of how I've been going about it. I just feel like I'm not helping this first grader as much as I should because of that. But that's ESL.
Yeah, I understand completely having to add kids in and pull kids out and switch groups around, and all of a sudden stopping in the middle of a day and just going to a principal and saying, look, this isn't working. I'm going to have to take this afternoon, and I'm going to have to redo this schedule because this is not working for me. It's not working for my kids. I've actually had to do that. Just by lunchtime, I had it, and I didn't know what else to do, and I went to the principal. I said, this is not working. These groups aren't working. We have to figure something else out. And they're like, okay, well, let's figure it out.
And it's a good time of the year. I mean, I think especially with those like kindergarten first, because I think as your classroom teacher, they're going to want them all. They're going to want them all in there all day and really, you know, as much as they can. But then I think once they start realizing little Andrew is not progressing either, then I think the classroom teacher becomes more flexible even in, as long as you're not pulling from core instruction.
Yes.
You know, but you've got a little 15 minutes where they're in stations or whatever. Can you come grab them then? I think your timing and even asking for those things.
Yeah, this point of the year, because they've had enough time to get to know them better, and they've started to see a lot more of the things that we see since we're in such small groups with them. So they start, and I mean, in the little ones, sometimes only doing 10, 15 minutes at a time. I know it's hard, and I know going between schools, that's hard to do, 10, 15 minutes here, 10 or 15 minutes there. But sometimes you see greater growth that way, especially with a kindergartner, because that's about as long as they can keep their focus on something anyways. And then it's quality over quantity, because if you keep them in there for the hour, 20 minutes into it, they're already, are we done yet? They're bored, they're over it, and then you get frustrated and, well, I got my time in. And then you think about it later and you feel terrible because you know that there's more that you could have done after the fact. I think we've all been there at some point.
And it takes you to strategies sometimes too, as far as, and we've had this conversation before, you know, classroom, which is letters and sounds, the importance of that versus vocabulary. Because I think when you've got those that are really, really struggling, I think the sooner they can learn what that sync is, and eventually if they can tell you sync, 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 then you're hoping that's going to transfer over to, okay, now this is a letter A, this is a sync, this is a letter A. I mean, you know, as far as getting that memory, because it's like people say, if you can learn what a triangle is, you can learn about anything. Different when it comes to blending. That's a different ballgame. We don't blend syncs. But as far as identification, that goes a long way.
Hey, does anybody else have any more questions or thoughts, concerns, anything? No? Okay. Well, thank you guys. I had fun looking at all this stuff and getting it all together. I learned a lot. While doing it, and I figured out real fast which one my favorite one was, and I think you guys did too, because the TELL test seemed to be most cost efficient, the least time consuming, and probably the best options for our kids. And since they're able to do it on their own and it scores it on its own.